Back in my day, there was this thing called the Rubik's Cube. It was a puzzle that you twisted and turned to get all the colors to one side and to make a beautiful pattern where all the colors aligned. And it seemed like no matter how you twisted or turned, it would just lead to utter frustration and seemed impossible to solve. It seemed like almost that you needed to be a magician and have a magic trick to do it. However, what you discovered was that there was a pattern, that there was a system into doing it. And once you learned that pattern and system, it would take you mere seconds to solve. And you would never have to use anything else to do it. It could be jumbled as much as possible, and still, if you use the system, you'll solve it. In writing, there's something similar called the 3-act structure. The 3-act structure is a system that's designed to help you tell your story. Most stories, if not all, have a 3-act structure. It's the how you get to the 3-act structure that's the interesting part in writing, because not everybody does it the same. There are many methods that you can use to get to the 3-act structure, and that is what this show is about, as we take a look at how you develop your own 3-act structure that works for you.
Hi, my name's Mike Feria. I am a horror author, but I also write in sci-fi and fantasy. My first novel, my debut novel, it's called Passenger, and that's a supernatural horror. Then I just got signed for another contract for my newest book, which is going to be a series called Scrivendar, and my first book is called The Treachery of Nikoros. And that should be coming out sometime in 2021.
Hi, I'm Anita. I write under A.F. Stewart. I also write horror and fantasy and a little poetry. I've written a trilogy called Saga of the Other Islands. My latest horror one is a story collection called Visions and Nightmares. And my newest series is coming out in October, and it's called The Camelot Immortals. And basically, that's me.
Hi. I am Lisa, and I write under L.A. Smith, and I write historical fantasy, and I've done 2 of the 3 books of the trilogy that I'm working on right now. The first one is called Wilding, and the second one I just released. The first one was released last summer. The second one just came out this past summer in August, and it's set in 7th century England. It's a portal fantasy of someone from, our time going back in time to that era.
And I'm Jim Nettles. As myself, I write mostly in nonfiction spaces, everything around business of creativity, futurist privacy, stuff like that. As James P. McDonald and a couple of other names, I write science fiction, fantasy, horror, urban fantasy. Right now working on a bit of steampunk, and also getting ready to kick off a new trilogy with a partner that's an environmental one. I am also founder for Author Essentials, which is an author services and author education company. And I am one of the founders for Continual, the Never-Ending Convention.
The interesting thing about research is there are so many approaches to it, right? There's the before, the during, and the after. And I'm curious to know from each of you what your process is and how has it evolved. Are you somebody that does it during, after, before, and has that changed for you?
I started before and during. I do general research before, so I get an idea of whatever time period I'm using. And then as I write, I research specific things, like what type of cabinets people used and what type of guns they had. If I'm like when I was doing my Hell's Empire story, I had a research of Victorian muskets and guns, whatever they were using, and and I also researched demonology for that one, so that was a fun day.
Only a day?
Yeah, the morning was YouTube videos on Victorian era weapon guns, and the afternoon was looking up demonology.
Mine is probably some of all of the above, because If I'm doing a new series, because I mean, I do a lot of things that are pull very heavily from myth, legend, folklore, and whatnot. And so depending on how I'm going to twist it, I always want to make sure I know when I'm playing with the folklore, what I'm doing with it. So at least it's an educated decision when I go off the rails. But it's not uncommon to be in the middle of a story and go and say, I need something that does X, or, you know, you're going down a path where you look and you say, I need to know what was available during a given time period. I need to know technologically how something may have advanced, because if you're working in sci-fi, you may be looking, you know, all of a sudden something shows up in the news and you go, ooh, I can use that. And you've got to dig deeper down the rabbit hole. My big defining what you call research. I've got a piece that's coming out next, I think in, first quarter of next year, that is on fairy folklore and film and non-traditional ways it was used. Well, the research came back to me afterwards, because they were like, all this is great. Can you also do research on these couple of things? Because I think you missed a couple of things. And it's because I was working with an editor who was an expert in an area much more than I was. And it was like, all right, yep, we can go down this rabbit hole a little bit more. I'm going to spend, a couple of hours in Wikipedia, and please don't use Wikipedia as your main source. Please don't use Wikipedia as your main source. It's a great thing to start going down the rabbit hole, but don't use it as your main source. I've got a pretty extensive library. I've got, and your library system is hugely helpful, and never be afraid to call somebody who's an expert in a given field and have a conversation, because if you are going to go down a particular rabbit hole, it is better to make sure that's an educated decision when you go off the rails than to have readers in a specific genre and go, that China pattern didn't exist in 1855.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, because my book is set in a very specific time and place and a real historical era, I felt that I really needed to know, what all the ins and outs of that time and place. So, I mean, yes, you start with general knowledge of Wikipedia, and then definitely you don't stop there for sure. And there's a lot of, there's as close, when you're doing a historical era, it's good to get to as close to the source as you can. So in my case, there's, not a lot of original material to draw from. Other eras have more, but, if you can get to letters from people, or, memoirs that people have written who lived in that time or whatever. But, and for me too, it's also research in terms of the setting. Because I don't live in England, so I had to do a lot of research as to Northumbria and the specific locations that I was writing about, particularly Lindisfarne and Bamberg and York, and kind of Northumbria in general. I mean, there's lots of ways of doing it, and when you're saying before or during or after, yes, all of that. After in terms of editing, because sometimes it took me quite a long time to write books, and there's always more knowledge coming out even as you're writing. And so sometimes I would, read an early draft and like, oh, right, I think I heard something more recent about that particular, happening or battle or setting or whatever. So you could go back and fix a few things on, as you're doing the editing as well.
Yeah. As for myself, in a way, I kind of feel like I've been researching my entire life. If you would have asked me like a decade ago, if I would have had two books on the chopping block, getting ready to come out at some point, I'd have told you were crazy. But I always enjoyed watching documentaries and learning things that most people will tell you is boring. They're like, history is boring. Why do you even bother about that? And I'm like, because it makes cool conversation. When you're talking to other people, and you never know when a double-bladed pole arm or something might be interesting to talk about at a bar somewhere with a friend. You know what I mean? So I've always been learning. I just like being this big human sponge. I didn't really do a whole lot of research when I was writing Passenger, which is my debut novel, because it was kind of like just my life in a way, but a fictional account of my life, so I mean, there really wasn't a whole lot of research that actually needed to be done. with that one because it's contemporary for the most part. It takes place between like the 1980s and, you know, the later 2000, 2020, 2030, because it takes place over time. But my second novel, which is called Scrivendar, you know, I didn't really need to do a whole lot of research with that either, because that one takes place on an alien planet in a completely different galaxy where no humans exist. But I still had to do some research on weaponry and stuff like that, because I'd imagine that if you're in a medieval place somewhere, okay, then you're going to have weapons of some kind. Scrivendar takes place kind of like in medieval times, but with magic and stuff as well. So I had to research different kinds of weapons and stuff and like add my own additions to it to make it sound interesting and stuff like that. But, you know, an axe is an axe, a sword is a sword. And I'd imagine that that kind of stuff exists anywhere.
Well, let me ask you this, Mike. Did you do a lot of that before you started, or was that something you had to do during the process, or now that you've released, you know, or given somebody else a draft, are you thinking you're going to have to do more?
I might have to do some more, but more or less, I do my research as it's needed. You're going to be wasting your time if you don't, if you do a bunch of research and don't end up using it.
So Mike brings up a good point about something that I wanted to touch upon too. So I'm going to go ahead and just piggyback on what Mike was saying a little bit. And that is about how much of the research is plausible. How much do you do for education and how much do you do for usage? And is there a difference for you?
Well, like I said, I do basic research before I start a book, especially if I'm doing like a historical fantasy, just to get a feel of the place and the customs and stuff. That's just basically for my head and to get an idea of how I'm gonna write. But I can't research everything at the beginning because I don't know what I'm going to put in the book until I write it. So basically, it's like when I was writing my historical fantasy set in 15th century Venice, I'm writing a scene and I realize I have no idea what a 15th century Italian cabinet looks like, and my character's going to have to rifle through one. So I had to go look that up. And then another, when he gets home, I mean, I had an idea, you know, he lights a fire and I'm going, wait, do homes in Venice in the 15th century have chimneys? Do they have fireplaces? And so I had to go look that up and find out what the structure was in the 15th century Venice, which is interesting in itself because that was a rabbit hole I fell down and I'm still falling in.
Do you feel like a lot of it, though, you use because you did that, you spent that time researching, or do you feel like a lot of it just helps you better to get the background of what you're trying to say?
Well, some of it does, but yeah, a lot of it is specific to what I'm writing. But then there's also things when you're researching generally that you come across and you're going, wait, that would be great for the book. It's like, because, you know, I was researching the city before I was writing, and I came across this little place in Venice that would fit in perfectly to where the character was living. As you go along, you're adding things like, he's going to get breakfast? Where is he going to get breakfast? Are there restaurants in the city? Are there food carts, 15th century style food carts, which is basically what I went with eventually. And what kind of food did they serve? What did they eat? You know, these things you have to research as you go more than overviews, because there's specific things, like, because if he's eating dinner, he's got different food if he's eating breakfast and stuff like that.
Nobody wants to be called out for being like, nobody had chimneys in Venice in 1520. Like, what are you talking about? And it's like,
actually,
okay,
they did have chimneys.
You know?
Well, the more specific your time period is that you're writing about, the more specific your research is going to have to be. So you're going to assume that people who have an interest in 15th century Venice might be picking up your book. So those people might actually know more than you do about 15th century Venice because it's their particular area of interest. So you have to be kind of cognizant of that. Although, I mean, you do have to realize that you're also writing fiction. So, as you go along, you learn more. And as you go along and you're writing your story, there are things that, I was very careful of trying to stay within the bounds. Although with Anglo-Saxon England, there's quite a lot that, historians either disagree about or they don't know about. So you can pick, one of the theories about that particular item or battle or place or person and just go with that. Or you can kind of make up stuff that fits your story. So as long as it's not, violating something hugely, they didn't have guns in Anglo-Saxon England or whatever, that kind of a thing. You can kind of play with it a little bit as a fiction writer.
Yeah, well, that is one of the good things about Venice is that it had a lot of influences.
Yes.
So I get to pick and choose with a lot of stuff too. So that's good.
When you're writing a novel and trying to write an actual story, you have to know the things like, what are they, you're right, like someone sits down to eat. Okay, well, what are they eating? Do they have a fork? Like, I had to look up that.
Yeah.
What do they eat with? Do they have what are they drinking? Do they have water? Do they, what, all that stuff, right? So it becomes it can be very, very broad in terms of, the whole milieu of what's going on outside in the character's world, but it's also very, very specific in terms of what do they put on when they get up out of bed. Wow, wait a minute. Are they in a bed? Are they on furs? Are they sleeping on the floor? That kind of stuff, right? So
yeah, don't get me started about beds. I had to do 5th century Britain beds there for my novel, the new novel. So yeah,
everything is there's a huge amount of rabbit holes that you can go into, and I think as people who write history, particularly, we're interested in history, and so that temptation is definitely there to go further down the rabbit hole than you need to. Although it's an enjoyable rabbit hole most of the time, but yeah.
The other thing you got to make sure of the rabbit holes you go down, because I mean, for me, if 5% of the research I ever do on something makes it into a book, that's a lot. But all of the information I find probably influences that building that world, because you don't necessarily want to come in and do the info dump about the necessarily everything to build the world, but you want to know and be informed as to what was it like, what was the feel, and that way you can salt in the things that make sense as you go along. But the other thing about doing the research is, especially when you're working in certain genres, making sure that you're also being true to the genre, to the tropes of that particular style of story, so that whatever you're slipping in there, you're also being true to what your readers expect. I mean, so if you're writing historical romances and you're dealing with somebody who reads historical romances, and they may actually know and care about what China patterns went on from 1851 to 1855. I don't, but there's going to be somebody that's a reader that does. I don't necessarily write in that world either. But if I'm also in there writing, say, for example, I'm working on a piece that is steampunk. It's for a world that doesn't exactly exist. But again, everything in that world has a foundation in history of the late 1800s. It has foundation in technology. It has foundations in alternate technology. So knowing what could have been and then salting in things that carry them technologically forward by leaps and bounds in other directions is important. I'm doing research about things that would be feasible. And then sometimes there's the things you come up with that are just, IFM. It's magic. It's you need that little bit of technology to make something happen. But it depends on how real you're writing to be and who your readers are. And I think sometimes knowing who your reader base is just as important to know what level of world building or what level of detail they're looking for and expecting.
Well, for me, I tend to read a lot more in the nonfiction genres of things. I kind of like war history and stuff like that. One of my favorite books was called The Gulag Archipelago by a guy named Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Another one that I really liked was this one. It was called Storm of Steel by a fellow named Ernst Junger. He's dead now, but it was a World War One, a German World War One account. So that was translated from German into English, and so like different stuff like that, and you get to like really feel like how and like all that stuff was like, like torture chambers and just like nutso stuff like that. But it really helps me learn different stuff because it interests me in a way, okay, but it's still repulsive. But it's like it's scarier to me that this is an actual account. This is like a historical account of things. So for myself, by reading these different kinds of books, it helps me put a more realistic spin on the fiction that I write, because the thought of writing nonfiction scares me to death. I don't know. I would probably be very good at it if I really wanted to get into it, but I'm still scared to try. But I like to read nonfiction so that I can write the most compelling fiction that I can, because I want it to be believable. I want people to like feel the world that I'm building, or at least like understand where I'm coming from. The reader either believes what you're putting into your fiction or they don't.
Well, and in the end, I mean, the research and everything that you're doing to build the world is really the background to the character and the story that you're telling. So it has to support everything that's going on in the story, but it can't be like, like you were saying, the info dump. That gets very tiresome for readers because they're really wanting to know about the character and how he or she is interacting in that world, and what, how that is. The world itself is not to be first and foremost. It's actually the story and the character that is important to the reader in the end if they're reading fiction.
One of the things that we frequently talk about is however many people enter the room, you need to make sure that many people either leave the room or their body's on the floor. It's sometimes that simple.
In doing all this research that you may or may not use, but it gives you some background, it gives you some influence, you feel like the characters develop better because you have that knowledge, even if you may not use it within the context of telling the story or even revealing it to the audience.
Yeah, if you can visualize the world as you write it, it's a lot easier to write.
I was just going to say, it's like world building in general for fantasy novels. I mean, the more the author knows about the world, it's easier to put your characters in there. I'm a more what they call a pantser. So I'm writing and I'm learning about things as I go along. So kind of like Anita was saying there, with you get to a point where I don't know what they put on this morning. So what would they put on? And then you go and research that part, or you can kind of leave it blank and finish writing the scene if you're kind of in the mode of inspiration and something's really working for you as you're writing, and then go back and fill it in later.
Yeah.
Well, and one of the other things is, just because you don't directly mention something you found in research doesn't mean it didn't influence the end product. So if you've come in and you've talked about things, the other thing is you never know what's that tidbit you're going to find in the research that makes its way into the book, because it becomes an important detail, an important fact, or maybe even that plot piece that you go and say, oh, this fixes a problem, and oh, it's real. There's lots of ways to do that. So, I mean, you can do too much research. It's called never writing the book. Mm-hmm. But if you're out there doing realistic research along, especially if you're developing a full series, if you're building a whole brand new world, knowing and having a well-rounded experience to work from. One of the things that Mike mentioned was write what you know. Well, if we look at a lot of the science fiction that came out of the 50s and 60s and the people that wrote it, or look at even like Lord of the Rings, these were all people that went through war. They were there in person, World War I, World War II. They were in trenches. And you can see the influence of that experience make its way into the work. Because research is in a way much more accessible and available than it was even 20 years ago, it's easy now to dive into a rabbit hole and stay there. I think the hardest part is sometimes knowing where to start to even ask the question. And I think that's really the biggest thing about research is what's the question you're trying to answer and how rounded are you trying to make the result.
As far as us as writers go, it has never been easier to research things than it is nowadays. Now, it's also easier to get false information too.
Yeah.
You know, because you have to at some point you got to kind of like verify it and make sure that it's not just somebody's opinion. But I mean, can you imagine trying to write a book, a factual book, back in 1825 or anywhere before the internet was created, and like the encyclopedias you would have to have in your home, you know, in order to write real factual stuff, you know. But nowadays with having the internet, you can just basically type in whatever you want and you can find roundabout whatever you're looking for, you know. But you just have to be careful what you're writing is fact.
Having research skills is infinitely useful. And like I say, the biggest risk is, do you get lost in the rabbit hole? But one of the other biggest resources I think that we a lot of the time will fall down on, we just did a show recently about writing with people with characters with disabilities. And so we had a whole panel that was nothing about writing with characters with disabilities, character development, character research. And the number one thing that came back from everybody, because pretty much everyone on the panel had something or multiple conditions, was how to do the research to contact someone and say, what is it like to be blind? What is it like to be this? What is it like for this condition? You know, there is no replacement for being on the ground to be somewhere to get the feel for it. I've got the benefit of having traveled a lot for work. I've been a lot of places internationally. So I've had the benefit of being a museum hound, going in, walking through, seeing artifacts, touching pieces. I've had the benefit of standing on the ground in a lot of places. And you know, you stand in Ireland and you look at the ocean and you're standing on the cliffs. That's a very different feeling than you're going to get even just looking at a picture or even a 3D image off of Google. But those resources, if you can't get to a castle in England, you know, using Google, using some of those tools where there's pictures and even now a lot more 3D maps, you can walk through and tour a place and a location to get the feel and the look for that place.
I also believe in really authenticating your own work and being there, because my first novel was about, you know, police detectives and it was the Los Angeles homicide, and I have the luxury of obviously being able to go to Los Angeles and be there and take a ride along. But the thing that was the funny thing that ended up happening for me was that when I went on this ride along, it was the most boring thing I've ever done in 4 hours. And the most stuff that I used for my book was when I was sitting in the precinct waiting for either the ride along to start or to leave. And because you have to be processed out when you do a ride along, so you have to sit in there and they go through this processing and thing. So I'm sitting there and I'm observing everything that's going on in this precinct. And there was a lot of things going on, and I can't imagine that Google would have ever given me that.
I still raid used bookstores. I mean, one of the best finds I found in the last couple of years was I found the police manual that was used to teach new cops from 1973.
Oh yeah, perfect. Used bookstores are a good place to go find stuff that, you know,
and I have no idea if I'll ever use it, but damned if there wasn't some interesting stuff in it.
Yeah, I found a great book on tall ships at a used bookstore with actual pictures of ship structure in the back, which was invaluable.
Looking back at some of these, you know, books and stories that are written in that era, there was nobody who didn't have some kind of religion. We have to be careful about that too.
Yeah, the church is a big part of my historical fantasy. So, yeah, you do have to get into that mindset. And I'm trying to sort of balance the rigidity of the church with some progressive elements as well. And then there's the Venice nuns, which are a whole different ballgame.
Just all of you, thank whoever you want to thank, whatever you look up to in the sky or down to in the floor, and that you have the internet, because Fuck micro push machines. That's all I'm gonna say. Those
Micro push
suck
machine.
ass.
I don't even know what that means.
They should-
All right, Mike, you can just go away now.